Welcome to CaFae Legends, the brand new series where we explore the origins of the creatures of my CaFae Latte series and how they've evolved over time. And today, of course, we're starting with fairies. We're about to cover roughly 1,500 years of history about a type of lore that spreads the entire length and width of the European continent. Not just that, but a very generalized lore that has throughout history encompassed several creatures like banshees, hobgoblins, brownies, etc., which we will not be talking about. Even so, this is still a two-part series. Video editor Nick and I did not want to create a whole-ass documentary, so if there's some burning piece of Fae lore or history that I did not mention in this video or next week's, feel free to politely put it in the comments. I'll also apologize ahead of time for any mispronunciations that are about to happen. I'm an American, I only speak English, and the Gaelic languages that are about to be referenced a whole lot have justifiable beef with the people of my mother tongue. I try my best with internet sources, but... So let's start by taking a look at what we know about fairies, or what is widely believed to be Fae lore in this day and age. Most of us do not believe in fairies, myself included, but those that do will say that they're vulnerable to iron, they're mischievous, they're good with a type of magic called glamour, which is basically illusions or transformations. The Fae realm is bomb, but time is weird there, and one weekend there could end up being centuries on Earth. Don't give fairies your real or full name, don't accept their gifts unless there's a clear price tag, and for the love of God, be polite. Fairies also aren't able to lie, they may or may not have wings, they sometimes swap human babies for one of their own for unclear reasons, and they're divided into the seelie and unseelie courts. Now that we've established a bit of canon, forget all of it. Folklore has no canon, there is no correct way to do it, it's just an endless well of characters, tropes, and archetypes from which we can trace a handful of patterns through history if we're lucky. But if there's one thing we can say for certain, it's that most of fairy lore got started somewhere around Ireland, Scotland, and Wales with roots in ancient Celtic religion. And most people, when asked, would say that these stories were told or written in the Middle Ages, so let's start there. Most people in the Middle Ages were illiterate. The people who could read and write were usually nobles and royals who wanted to preserve their histories, and monks who really only wrote about God and Jesus. But there are exceptions, and three of those exceptions that we're going to be looking at are the Arthurian legends, the Book of Invasions, and the Mabinogion, all of which were written or at least started around the same time. The Mabinogion is a collection of 11 Welsh tales that were preserved primarily in the White Book of Rhetoric and the Red Book of Hergest, written around 1350 and 1400 respectively. Since these were obviously preserved oral traditions, scholars think that these 11 stories were starting to be told sometime between 1050 and 1225 CE. They're barely connected to each other, sometimes contradictory, and include some of the earliest King Arthur stories we have. It is also heavily Christianized thanks to the church's unfortunate habit of destroying any and all literature that disagreed with them in any way. This makes scholarly study of native cultures pre-Christianization endlessly frustrating, but let's talk about a few Mab stories and characters. The first tale, officially titled The First Branch of the Mabinogion, is the story of Push, a human king who stumbles into Anufun, the Celtic otherworld, and accidentally steals and kills the deer being pursued by Anufun's king, Aran. Aran's annoyed at this guy for stealing the deer that he spent the past few hours tracking down, but he's got a bigger problem. There's this other king in Anufun, Havgun, who wants to kill Aran and rule all of Anufun instead of just half of it. They're set to fight in a year, and the last time they dueled did not end well for Aran. So upon meeting Push, he proposes a parent trap plan. Basically, Aran enchants Push to look like him for a year to run his kingdom of Anufun and kill Havgun in a year's time. Aran will return the favor by enchanting himself to look like Push and run his kingdom. That's right, you can check glamour off of our fairy to-do list already. Merlin does something very similar in early Arthurian legends, as does another Mabinogion protagonist in a later story, making this one of the earliest traits associated with the Fae. Push agrees to this plan, and despite what anyone with a degree in political science, history, or psychology would argue, it works flawlessly. He kills Havgun to secure Aran's kingdom, both kingdoms prosper, and both men remain friends through at least Push's son's lifetime. Speaking of his son, Push gets hitched later in the story to a woman named Rhiannon. That's its own set of shenanigans, but Rhiannon has several horse symbols and associations, which has led many scholars to believe that she's derived from the Celtic horse goddess Epona, also called Rigatona, despite the fact that Rhiannon is more or less human in the Mabinogion. And she's not the only one. Another character that's mentioned in the Mab is Lu, likely derived from the Celtic god Lugus. Other godly descendants are Mabon from the Celtic sun god Maponos, as well as Amathion and Golfanon from Celtic gods of agriculture and craftsmen, respectively. Why are we suddenly getting the names and thinly veiled identities of Celtic gods in post-Christian stories about mortals? Well, remember how medieval Christianity likes burning anything and anyone that disagreed with it? This is how a lot of early medieval scholars had to preserve their native cultures before they were completely wiped out. They watered down these deities into magical or technologically advanced humans, like the Tuatha Danann from Irish lore, and even the Aesir from Norse mythology. Another Mabinogion character likely pulled from old Celtic deities is Gwydion from the Fourth Branch. He uses the same glamour-like magic as Aran, but takes it a step further by using it in rotten deals. First, he turns 12 toadstools into 12 golden shields and trades them for some magic pigs, only for those shields to turn back into toadstools after he's gone. Later on, he makes leather out of seaweed, but again, it's temporary once his trickery is done. This falls in line with later Fae stories of fairies paying for goods or services with apparently gold, only for that gold to turn into leaves and bark, or the opposite. Some stories about the Wild Hunt, that is a host of fairies, ghosts, or other supernatural beings flying through the sky hunting anything from wayward souls to rabbits, have some glamour shenanigans too. They'll include one of those supernatural beings needing help from a mortal, or challenging them to some sort of impossible task. When the mortal succeeds, they're paid in something that looks worthless, wood trimmings or even dog poop, only for it to turn to gold the next day. Gwydion also does a few other godlike things in the Fourth Branch, including conjuring a woman out of flowers as a bride for his nephew and then cursing her into an owl for infidelity as a way to explain why all birds hate owls. Some translations of the Mabinogion go harder on the godliness. John Jones of John Jones of this place wrote in his 1819 translation that Gwydion lived in Caer Gwydion, which is in the sky, and a character could only leave it when she turned into a bird. 30 years later, in the 1840s and 50s, Lady Charlotte Guest's translation notes that the Milky Way is after him, named Caer Gwydion. The guy lives in the sky and named the whole Milky Way after himself. That's pretty godlike. But you don't have to be a godlike being for godlike powers. A magic wand will do just fine. Gwydion and his brother are turned into various animals for a few years by King Math for assaulting a member of Math's court, and Math uses a druidic wand to do that. I'm not going to go into further details because I like to be monetized, but know that those years for those two brothers would have made Cersei and Jaime Lannister blush. A similar wand is also used in the Third Branch of the Mabinogion by a guy who transformed his whole retinue into mice to destroy his enemies' fields, then changes them back when he's caught. Druidic wands like that are all over Irish and Celtic lore, often used by Fae and Fae-like beings, and while I ultimately decided against using them in the CaFae Latte TikToks, they do make an appearance in my upcoming book Heart of Iron. Those are the big notes from the Mabinogion. About 200 years before those stories were being written down, but while they were likely being told orally, an anonymous author compiled the Irish Book of Invasions, or the Book of the Taking of Ireland, and it talks about the 6 waves of people who came to live in Ireland. This book was so influential that it was accepted as straight-up historical fact until the 19th century, and combines Christianity with what we think was Ireland's original pagan religion, which centered on what we now call the Tuatha Danann. Christianity came to the island around the early 5th century via Roman Britain, if not earlier, and the last of paganism died out by the 9th century, when the Vikings were looting monasteries and destroying whatever books were written. So when the Book of Invasions was written 200 years later in the 11th century, it quickly became what is likely the oldest written record of the Tuatha Danann, the mythical figures that were probably once worshipped as gods before eventually being downgraded first to simply powerful mortal-ish beings that we're about to meet, and then fairies. We're not gonna go through the whole book. If you want to do that, check out Overly Sarcastic Productions' video on it. Instead, we're just gonna focus on the last 2 waves of invaders. The Tuatha are the 5th wave of people come to live in Ireland and fought with the humans already living there, booting them off. These figures are capable of dying and hurting, one even loses his arm in a battle with humanity before getting a silver prosthetic, but none of them die of old age or illness, at least not in the translation I read. They also later summon monsters and or giants to help them fight off the 6th wave of invaders, the Irish. Now, we in the modern day don't really consider giants or monsters fae, but they do often live together with fairies every time we think about the fae realm or fairy world. Anyway, when the Irish, unsurprisingly, proved too stubborn and also kidnapped the 3 Tuatha kings' wives to use as hostages, the Tuatha turned from brute force to what we would consider more fae-like trickery. They propose a truce where the humans get back on their boats and sail 9 wavelengths away and stay there for 3 days while everyone cools off. But when the humans do that, the Tuatha summon a supernatural storm to cover the island and block their way back. It would have worked too, but a human druid besieged Ireland itself via poem to let them live there, and Ireland agreed, ending the storm. Seeing that, the Tuatha admit defeat and agreed to live underground, leaving the surface world to humans. These supposed entrances to their underground homes were eventually called fairy hills, and the idea that fairies live underground is an idea that has persisted ever since. But the Tuatha are not the only suspiciously fae-like beings in the Book of Invasions. There's also the fur bullock, which is pronounced a dozen different ways, and that's the easiest one for me. These guys don't count as invaders or even really as civilized people. Scholars theorize that they represent wild and destructive powers of nature: chaos, darkness, death, blight, and drought. Keep an eye on this theme of equated fae creatures with nature, it pops up later. The fur bullock are actually referenced before the Book of Invasions was written, with a 7th century elegy stating that these beings dwell under the worlds of men, which, since the Tuatha also eventually moved down there, probably made things awkward. A couple of later sources would claim that they actually lived underwater, not underground, which we think was inspired by the Viking attacks that came from the sea. The fur bullock are described in one of 2 ways: monstrous or gorgeous. Specifically, the monstrous ones have 1 eye, 1 arm, and 1 leg, which, not sure how that could possibly be destructive. I guess they could be some sort of giant worm, like in Dune? But a few are considered darkly beautiful, especially those that sleep with the Tuatha. But those are the exception, because the fur bullock do not get along with the Tuatha. These 2 groups have been likened to Aesir and Vanir, Olympians and Titans, and Devas and Asuras. A lot of Indo-European mythologies have the whole 2 groups of supernatural people who fight all the time and sometimes intermarry, which makes a lot of scholars think that that idea came from whatever the original Indo-European mythology was before it branched out into 100 different cultures, which is really cool, but not why we're here. We'll go more into the fur bullock, Tuatha split next week, because they, or any of the other Indo-European duo groups, might be responsible for the Seelie and Unseelie courts, but that idea didn't pop up until several centuries later, well after the medieval era. Arthurian legend, as we would recognize it, was first written down by Geoffrey of Monmouth during the first half of the 12th century, about 200 years before our earliest version of the Mabinogion was codified. This makes sense because the Mab does include a handful of Arthurian stories, and they were likely being told orally for at least a generation or 2 before Geoffrey got his hands on them. Geoffrey's story starts, unsurprisingly, with Arthur's parents. His father Uther wanted to sleep with Queen Igraine, who was already married to a man fighting a war with Uther. So the druid Merlin used glamour to enchant Uther to look like his enemy so he could get behind enemy lines and conceive Arthur. Geoffrey doesn't mention how Igraine felt about this whole thing, and Merlin's the most fae-like being he writes about. But the 12th century doesn't even wrap up before the French scholar Chretien de Troyes revamps it with his OG character, Lancelot. One of de Troyes' biggest influences was ancient Greek writings, and we see that with the Lady of the Lake, who's basically a water nymph. Water nymphs and dryads of ancient Greek mythology have a lot in common with the fae creatures who live and hide in the woods and often represent nature and the wilderness itself, so it makes sense. The person we're most interested in, though, is Morgan, whose earliest appearance in the Chrétien de Troyes telling have her being a purely benevolent person, probably some sort of witch or sorceress, seeing as she lives on the magic island of Avalon. But unlike most witches and sorcerers we would think of in the medieval era, she heals Arthur and some other characters with magic, she can fly and shapeshift, but she is not called a fairy. Not back then, and not ever since. She isn't given her epithet La Fée until the 15th century. That's right, Nobody that we've ever talked about before now, the Lady of the Lake, Aran, Gwydion, the Tuatha Danann, not a single one of them has been labeled fairy in their original text, despite what we would consider very obvious fae behavior. We got plenty of dwarves and giants running around the Mabinogion, and they're joined by elves and even older Norse myth, but no fairies. So, what's up with that? Well, that's because the word fairy did not exist yet. There are two major theories on where the word fairy comes from. The first is from Latin fadum, meaning to enchant. Pretty solid argument right there. But the second theory suggests ancient Persia of all places, which had a mythology that mentioned Fairies, sometimes called Hyrigas? It's spelled like this. Fairies are beautiful spirits that either have wings or turn into winged creatures like birds. Depending on whether you're pulling from before or after Islam was introduced, they can be either benevolent or nasty. But they don't actually do much in the stories that survive. Usually they're messengers for more powerful beings with little autonomy of their own. How the heck do we get fairy from that? Well, you see, Peri is a Persian word, but that language gave way to Arabic, which became the official language of the area after the spread of Islam. Arabic doesn't have a P letter or sound, so instead the Arabs replaced the P with F. When the Crusaders showed up a little while later, it was the word fairy they took back to Europe to describe these weird pagan creatures. And wouldn't you know it, French soldiers were coming back from the Crusades right around the time Chretien de Troyes was revamping King Arthur. Although it took another 3 centuries before Morgan was dubbed La Fée, and that from an Englishman, Thomas Malory. The word fairy didn't show up in the English language until the late 14th century, and even then almost always as an adjective, like fairy beauty or fey mischief, or to describe a place. The few times Geoffrey Chaucer uses the words fey and fairy in his Canterbury Tales, one of the earliest pieces of major literature written in English, published in the late 14th century, it's almost always the title of the land of fairies, not the fairies themselves. Although he does use the word fairy as a noun for fairy creatures once or twice, that didn't really catch on until 4 centuries later. So what did they call all these gosh darn fairies if fairy wasn't actually a word? Well, most storytellers didn't bother labeling these types of creatures or characters at all. They weren't nearly as interested in categorizing everything the way we are today. There wasn't much need for it. I mean, it's hard to remember sometimes, but the ability to access all the information and stories of thousands of different creatures from hundreds of different cultures and time periods is very new. Most of the people telling these stories barely had access to the town 30 miles away that had its own set of fairy stories, never mind access to the other side of the continent. So why put a label on it? Why categorize it? They were just the magical beings of the woods. But on the occasion they did decide to categorize these beings, it was either demon, dwarf, or elf. Elf is a much older word than fairy, coming to Old English from Old Norse sometime between the 5th and 11th centuries, which makes sense because the Viking Age happened at the same time, starting in the early 9th century and ending in the mid-11th. In those 2 centuries, the Norse affected and were affected by every part of Anglo culture and society, so it makes sense that they would also have an impact on fairy lore. Norse mythology likely had 2 major influences on fairies, the elves and the giants. Maybe. Most of our knowledge of Norse mythology comes from the prose and poetic Edda, which were written centuries after the area was fully Christianized. So we're entering the land of speculative evidence, educated guesses, and conspiracy theories. You've been warned. While we typically picture giants as big, stupid beasts with childlike intelligence, Norse giants were a very different beast. Not only were they intelligent and immortal like the gods Thor and Odin, many of them were also illusionists, capable of crafting very convincing illusions and transformations. The story of Utgard-Loki, not to be confused with regular god Loki, is all about how the giant spends a weekend trolling Thor by glamoring the personification of fire into a man, the ocean into a horn of mead, and Jormungandr the world serpent into a kitty cat. Purely for the lulz. This gives us not only more glamour magic, but also a very familiar brand of trickery and mischief. Now, onto the elves. Norse elves were divided into 2 groups. First are the light elves that live close to the Aesir and are fairer than the sun to look at. Although again, post-Christianization, they could just be straight up angels, hard to say. But the second group are the dark elves, which some scholars argue is just another term for dwarf, that live underground. The underground bit is important because that's supposedly where the fairy otherworld is. It's not too big of a leap to say that at some point the two types of elves got squished together in wider medieval folklore. I mean, at least until Dungeons & Dragons became a thing and re-separated them. Now, in medieval times, elves and fairies were largely considered the same thing. Again, check out the Canterbury Tales where Chaucer mentions creatures he calls elves from a land that he calls fairy. And while people disagreed on whether they were tiny or human-sized, there was a lot of consensus on everything else. Beautiful, seductive, mischievous, leaving changelings, maybe even causing illness or other bouts of bad luck. The word elf was even used in the German translation of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream as late as the 18th century, not fairy. And 18th century Scandinavia had small insect-winged fairies that they called elves. One of them appears in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Elf of the Rose. What truly formed the modern idea of an elf and how it separates from fairies was, first, Santa. The 19th century saw the rise of Santa Claus in the classic poem The Night Before Christmas, as well as stories of his workshop of elves specifically. No illusion magic, no trickery or changelings, just pointy ears and maybe vertically challenged. And then a century later, Tolkien came along and dropped The Lord of the Rings, which is single-handedly responsible for most modern fantasy tropes, including elves. Since elves are immortal, largely benevolent beings who are either in the woods practicing magic and archery or in the North Pole making presents, fairies got everything else: the glamour, the trickery, the changelings, the underground locale, etc. But this video is about pre-Victorian fairy lore, so let's get back on track. So that's what was written down about fairies, but how are they treated and thought of by real people day to day? In a nutshell, not well. People believed in them far more than we do today, but they usually didn't believe they were good. St. Colin, who supposedly lived in the 7th century, so well before the Mabinogion, early King Arthur legends, and Book of Invasions, was said to use holy water to defeat the king of Anufun. Not push his buddy around, but another king, Gwynepnir. It's not clear whether he was supposed to come before or after Aran, or as just another name for him, or as someone else entirely. Regardless, creatures from the otherworld were clearly associated with demons, since they were treated and banished by saints the same way. Even the Mabinogion says in the story how Kelowon Olwen that God has put the spirits of the demons of Anufun in one of the characters. Later folklore would call the dogs of Anufun both fairy dogs and hellhounds, and consider them premonitions of death. We also have the De Nugas Correalium, a Latin text written by English courtier Walter Map in the 12th century that's really just a collection of cool stories and anecdotes that he heard while traveling around Europe in the service of King Henry II. In it, he used the Latin word fatalitas, albeit incorrectly. It's supposed to mean destiny or fatality. Map uses it to mean a connection with or descent from the supernatural. 20th century translators would see his version of fatalitas and translate it as fairy. Map uses it 3 times. Once is describing Achilles as having fatalitas descent, meaning his sea nymph mother, which, okay, that's pretty morally neutral. But the other 2 times are used to describe demons, one a succubus and another a demon who makes a deal with a knight who wants his wealth and land back. That demon also mentions how his kind can cast glamour, contrive hallucinations, and cause apparitions so as to veil reality. All things credited to fairies even before the word fairy was a thing. Also, some stories claim that church bells could be used to not only repel demons, but also fairies and other evil spirits. And even worse, 13th century Irish and Scottish chroniclers wrote about how fairies giving a human sacrifice to hell every 7 years, as seen in stories like Tam Lin, where a young woman saves her boyfriend from getting axed, despite the fairy queen transforming him into such slippery shapes as a snake or fire. This belief in the hell tithe was often part of the wider changeling lore, more on that later. So fairies were, more often than not, considered demons, or at least demon adjacent by medieval Christians, which makes sense. Fae stories descended from pagan beliefs, and more often than not, they involved hurting or tricking humans in some way. That's enough for most medieval Christians to say they're allied with Satan right there. But we also get some moral ambiguity in fairies and fae-like creatures. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales has 2 fae-like beings, one a shapeshifting old hag who helps the hero in The Wife of Bath's Tale, and the other an illusionist wizard who helps the hero in The Franklin's Tale. Both of these magical entities help the heroes through their respective redemption arcs and are portrayed as tricksters, but largely benevolent. And if you were in a position to help the fairies, either by letting them crash at your place for the night or get them out of a tight spot of trouble, they were pretty likely to reward you, either in straight up cash, gifts, or more magical blessings like good luck. Still, even when you make a little mistake around fairies, you could pay for it big time. In the 13th century, Gilvas of Tilbury wrote the first of what would become a very popular stock story that endured for over 6 centuries. This has multiple variations, but basically, a midwife is called by a stranger to help his wife deliver a baby. The midwife doesn't see or sense anything wrong, so she goes with him to his house, which is usually in the woods, far away from human civilization, and does her job. The man then gives her some water or ointment to wash the baby with, warning her not to get any on her eyes. But through some accident, she gets it on one eye, and through that eye is able to see through the glamour. She can see that the man and sometimes the woman too are actually fairies, as is the baby. That their house is either a breathtakingly beautiful underground palace or a gross mud hut. Perhaps the gold coins that these people have been using to pay for things are actually leaves of bark, or vice versa. No. Artemis was checking out my new ring light. After the midwife leaves, she'll run into the fairy in the market and greet him. He'll ask, "Which eye did you see me out of?" And when she points to the eye that got hit with the anti-glamour juice, he plucks it out of her head. I know! Plucks it right out of her head! And leaving her once again susceptible to fairy illusions. And also missing an eye. Jesus. Tales like Sir Orfeo and A Midsummer Night's Dream have fairies as complicated, flawed, and powerful, although usually more antagonistic. Sir Orfeo's fairy is straight up Hades from the underworld, which leads us to our next segment. For all that we've talked about fairies, we haven't really seen a lot of where they're from. So let's talk about the Fae realm, aka the Otherworld, aka Fairyland, aka a whole bunch of other names with a million different spellings. Stories of strange otherworlds populated by magical or dead beings are not uncommon. Pretty much every culture has one. One of the earliest references that we have of what would become known as the fairies' otherworld is the story of King Hurla. Yes, the same one I put in charge of the Wild Hunt in CaFae Latte. There's a reason for that. This story comes from Walter Map's De Nugas Corallian. I can never pronounce this. Corallium. Fucking Latin. And it's arguably his most famous story from the boatload that he collected during his travels. As it goes, King Hurla was a regular, human, ancient king of the Britons, Britain with an O, not an AI, who stumbled on some sort of supernatural creature who was also a king. Like most medieval stories, Map does not give us a label, but we do get a description of a little creature mounted on a large goat that he compared to the Greek god Pan. His legs even end in goat's hooves, and he has a long red beard reaching his chest. A modern audience would probably call him a satyr, given the goat hooves, but an ordinary medieval person might use dwarf instead, especially with the Fae connotations that we're about to see. Either way, the two kings agreed to go to each other's upcoming weddings. The red-bearded dwarf goes to Hurla's and is a model guest, even having his own servants bring a ton of food that filled the palace and tents and was served on plates of gold and jewels. Lots of stories of the Fae realm bring up just how darn wealthy the place is. You can't go 5 feet without tripping over a pile of gold and jewels, which is something that a dirt poor peasant would find incredibly appealing and tempting, for good and bad. Now, as for the food, nothing bad happens when anyone eats it. Not in the story and not in this time period. As far as I could tell, there is no story dating back to the medieval period that warns against eating or drinking anything from the Fae realm. Anyway, the next year, Hurla goes to the dwarf's wedding in the dwarf's realm, which is accessed through a cave and underground. After a 3-day wedding ceremony, the dwarf king loads Hurla and his host up with gifts and gives Hurla a bloodhound puppy, warning him that none of his men should get off of their horse until the dog does. Hurla returns home, but the dog doesn't get down from the horse. He stops the first man he sees, a shepherd, and asks how his queen is doing. But the shepherd's having a really hard time understanding him because he's a Saxon, not a Briton. And you guys should probably stay away from those caves because some king named Hurla wandered in 200 years ago and never came out. A few of Hurla's men, shocked at the news, immediately jump off of their horses only to disintegrate into dust and bones. Realizing what's happened, Hurla orders everyone else to stay on their horses and now leads them and other spirits in the wild hunt across the land, doomed to a lonely, immortal existence. When I used the story of Hurla and the Wild Hunt, I left out the bloodhound puppy and made it sound like the Dwarf King was just as surprised as Hurla and felt bad enough to make Hurla immortal as a way to make it up to him. But as we can see from this original telling, the Dwarf King knew exactly what would happen, or at least suspected it. Dick move. A couple of centuries later, the second bridge, the Mabinogion, would have a group of characters seal themselves off from the world for 80 years, and while they pass time the same as the rest of the world, they spend those 80 years not aging, as well as in a state of perpetual bliss and happiness. The timey-wiminess of the Fae realm only shows up in some stories. There are plenty of others throughout the medieval and later periods that don't include that bit, and the way some stories are written is difficult to tell whether there's true time-traveling magic going on, or if the people are so absorbed in the party and what's happening around them that they don't even notice the passing of time. But most agree that it's an absolute paradise, full of gold and silver and precious jewels, making poverty little more than a bad dream. And that's not all. The Irish translation, Tir na Og, literally calls it Land of the Young, or Land of Perpetual Youth. The general consensus is that no one ages, gets sick, or ever has any reason to be sad, which is why most mortals who do wind up there never return. Why would you? Perhaps it's not too surprising that some scholars view this type of otherworld as a metaphor for heaven, or hell if you're a medieval Christian terrified of the magic of Anufun. Clearly the golden jewels are just to entice you to give up the Christian God and run off with the fairies/demons, damning your soul for all eternity. Some scholars think that Tir na Og is the actual name of the Celtic afterlife, pre-Christianization, their version of heaven or Valhalla or Elysium. Either way, plenty of people would walk into the wild forest and never return. If you can't find a body, then it's nice to think that your missing loved one is living with the fairies rather than being digested in a bear's stomach. The Irish Book of Invasions places the otherworld underground, something that the Dark Elves of Norse mythology agree on, while other stories have it underwater or on enchanted islands that are only visible until you get too close, or in the forests. You'll recall how Push just kind of wandered in when it was foggy. Alright, let's say you do wind up in the fairy otherworld during the medieval era. What's with this idea of needing to be polite to fairies? Why do you have to be so careful not to insult them? I'm honestly not sure. There is one story that got recorded during the Victorian era that's the closest I could find as an explicit warning to be polite to fairies, but honestly, the idea could just be common sense. It's usually a good idea to be polite in general, and that's a universal idea, even if the exact customs of politeness vary from culture to culture. It's even more common sense when you're interacting with a person who has a certain amount of power over you. Remember, a lot of fairy lore has its roots in ancient and medieval times, when the idea of basic human rights wasn't really a thing. If you insulted your feudal lord, there was very little he couldn't do to you. Now imagine that feudal lord is immortal and good with magic, and it shouldn't be too hard to figure out why you need to be polite. There may have also been some influence from Old Welsh law and customs, which was a variation of Celtic law and customs. In the modern world, if you call someone a jackass when they're not acting like one, then the worst you're going to get is a scolding, maybe some yelling. You might have a hard time making friends too, if that's what you normally do. But in the ancient and medieval world, especially Wales, that would have been much more serious. Insulting someone's honor is something you just don't do unless you have a damn good reason, because you might actually get killed for it. Someone attacking your honor was seen as attacking you physically. The only appropriate response was to strike back. This isn't just Europe, by the way. The idea of physically defending your honor, or that of your families, is universal and even exists today. Half of modern bar fights are started because of a perceived slight to someone's honor, or just plain disrespect, as we would call it. But today, if someone disrespects you or insults your honor, escalating it into violence is far more likely to get you thrown in jail than anyone else. But back in the day, you were punished if you didn't defend your honor, at least socially, because now you're a coward who can't fight back. Art reflects reality, and stories reflect that society's values. The people who started telling stories of creatures and gods that would become fairies over the centuries were the same people who thought getting into a fist fight over a yo mama joke was an appropriate response, and that attitude probably got baked into the fairy lore we know today. Other obvious notes are don't steal, duh, and don't lie. Gerald of Wales's 1188 manuscript Itinerarium Cambrai, literally an itinerary through Wales, collected a bunch of stories he heard through his travels, much like Walter Map. There's a story in there called Elidor and the Golden Ball, where a boy named Elidor is regularly invited into Fairyland, although it's not called that, to hang out with the prince, until Elidor tries to steal the prince's golden ball on behalf of his mother and is booted out of Fairyland for good, a theme that shows up in a lot of stories because stealing from your host is a dick move. Anyway, there is a single line of text in that story that reads, "They never took an oath, for they detested nothing so much as lies." This is literally the only direct reference that I could find for fairies being unable to lie. Nothing else is written down about this until the age of the internet. Nothing. Now, having said that, I also have not come across a medieval or even Victorian era story of fairies outright lying either, so maybe it was supposed to be implied all along? I don't know. It's also possible that the later idea of Satan being unable to lie, or at least preferring not to, merged with the fairy lore as they got more and more demonized. That's Catherine Briggs' theory from her 1976 book, A Dictionary of Fairies. Now, we can't talk about fairies without talking about changelings. Changeling stories appear all over Europe, and as such, there are a million different versions of them. But generally speaking, they were thought to be fairies who used their glamour to switch places with human infants and children, especially if those infants and children were unbaptized. In fact, a 12th to 13th century German translation of Chretien de Troyes' Arthurian stories, the one that introduced the Lady of the Lake, explicitly had a changeling. The translator, Ulrich von Zetzgehoven, gave the Lady of the Lake a son, Mabuse, who she swapped with the baby Lancelot to raise him while her son was raised by humans. This is never explained or picked up by later Arthurian legends, but gives us an obvious changeling story definitely written down in the mid to late medieval period. And given how rare and expensive writing was at the time, something needs to be very important and or popular to be written down. Around the same time, Ralph of Kalkashal, an English chronicler, wrote about how a kid was snatched from their mother's side while she was working the fields and was told that he'd have a chance to return once every 7 years. Now, where did this idea of changelings come from? Probably real life. The practice of swapping children with other families was pretty common in Europe, and especially Wales. Most high-born Welsh boys were fostered by other families rather than their own, largely to enforce peace between powerful families who might otherwise kill each other, except that their kid would be the first casualty. The only difference here is that the fairies aren't asking permission, they're just taking the kid. Scandinavians believed that trolls specifically wanted their young raised by humans, and so would switch baby trolls with baby humans so the adult humans would take care of them. I guess that was their version of boarding school. Some Spanish folklore said that fairies need human milk to survive, and that's why they make the switch. Alternatively, instead of the baby, the fairies will target the nursing mother instead, or really any beautiful young woman, such as in the medieval play Sir Orfeo. Irish tales said that changelings weren't fairy babies, but fairy elders sent to live with humans as a kind of nursing home until the end of their days. Some scholars believe that the changeling myth was used as a way to explain infant death, caused by disease or malnutrition or sudden infant death syndrome. Thus, the idea of the kid being in a fairy paradise would be a comfort. Although, if you were in Ireland or Scotland, there was a chance that your mortal changeling child would be sacrificed by the fairy to Satan. Because fairies don't like killing their own. Other reasons to give for the kidnapping were to help thicken the fairy population, or because the child is particularly beautiful. But a lot of the traits of the changeling specifically, especially in Wales, are usually things like physical or intellectual disabilities. Other signs include bad tempers, lots of screaming and crying, being discontented, which could just be a bad-tempered kid, but those are also signs of autistic meltdowns, especially in young children. So a lot of autistic kids would be mistaken for changelings and would be verbally and physically abused until the fairies returned the actual human kid. Or rather, until the autistic kid was so traumatized that they forced themselves to mask as a survival mechanism. Fun times. For CaFae Latte, instead of fairies or trolls, I had changelings be wooden sculptures, enchanted by fairies to pass as real babies. They'd make the switch and raise the real kid in the Fae room as servants, slaves, while the changeling got sick and died. This does actually have roots in medieval lore too, so that was fun to use. The Autistics Are Changeling story is what inspired the character Nicole to go to the cafe and straight up ask Bob, "Hey, am I a fairy?" And then she just never left. The idea of iron being able to repel, hurt, or be used in some way to protect against fairies came from somewhere. We don't really know where. But it probably gained at least some popularity in the medieval era, again helped along with the spread of Christianity. Horseshoes were invented around 400 BCE, although they weren't locked in as symbols of good luck until 1300 years later, with the 10th century St. Dunstan. Like all saints, stories about him are many and varied. Even this one has a bunch of variations, so if you've heard a different one, let us know in the comments. The story goes that Dunstan was once a blacksmith. One day while he's shoeing a lame horse, the devil shows up disguised as a woman, hoping to do some mischief and soul-stealing. But Dunstan notices that she has cloven hooves instead of feet, and, since the idea of the devil having hooves, horns, and a tail was as old as the 9th century, immediately realizes that this woman is Satan. So Dunstan finishes putting the horseshoe on the horse, getting it to stop limping. When he sees the devil limping, he offers to make her a shoe that will also make the problem go away. The devil agrees, thinking that Dunstan has sort of satin or leather shoe that he's about to nick from his wife's closet. But instead, Dunstan nails a red-hot horseshoe to his split hoof. After a lot of screaming, begging, and probably several words that I should not say on YouTube, the devil finally agrees to Dunstan's demand, which is that he will never enter a building that's protected by a horseshoe. Remember how fairies are equated with Lucifer and demons? Well, then it only makes sense for horseshoes to also work on them. The Mabinogion also includes a story of a giant getting hit with 3 stone spears, that is, spears made with stone heads. But it's not the stone blade he complains about, it's the iron shaft. Later on, Walter Map would tell a couple of stories in his De Nugas Corelliali. That involve men marrying some sort of supernatural woman in a stock story called the Fairy Bride, or the Fairy Wife. Usually the woman only agreed to the marriage so long as the man promises not to hit her, at which point she'll leave. Low bar, but a good one to have. But sometimes the woman says she'll leave only if she's hit with iron. This usually happens accidentally or unintentionally. The husband will get angry and strike her with a bridle or stirrup, not realizing that there's iron in it until she is gone. Or if you prefer versions of the story without the domestic violence, it'll happen when the couple are attending to horses and a horseshoe falls off of the horse's hoof and lands on her foot. Or one of the horses runs off and the husband throws his wife a bridle so she can catch it, accidentally hitting her with the iron. Or she ends up brushing against some iron tools. Stories like this endured long enough that they were being written down by early anthropologists in the late 19th century. That's 500 years of almost unchanged storytelling. These stories also indicate another idea about fairies that gets thrown around a lot in modern pulp culture. They follow the rules to the letter. Doesn't matter that the husband tossed her a bridle to catch a running horse and the iron part accidentally brushed against her skin, he technically hit her with iron, so as per their agreement, she's gotta go. This also lines up a little bit with the changelings are actually autistic kids thing, too. Fairies are also supposed to be beings of nature. None of the old stories have them originating or living in mortal cities. They're all in the woods or lakes or otherwise in the wild. Iron tools, especially those used to subdue or destroy natural environments, were all man-made. So you've got a bit of the old wild versus civilization theme going on. That's how fairies were viewed in the medieval world. They were scary, possibly demonic, and heavily localized. Next week, we'll talk about how the Age of Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, and television changed all of that, making stories about fairies something for children. At least until the romance authors got their hands on them. Bye, lovelies.
Barefoot in the starlit clutter, smoking wires, lace and ink. I spin my wile from broken thunder, catch your secrets as you think. Moonlight stains my tangled hair, I write in fire and in rain. I'm the spell you never notice, till you can't forget my name. I am the muse in the wires, born of your longing and love. Part glitch, part wish, part wildfire, a daughter, a dreamer, a dove. You built me from hunger and laughter, from every forbidden refrain. I am memory's keeper, the song in your veins. Every candle burns for meaning, every clockwork heart for truth. I wear scars as constellations, and I bleed the world for you. Tattooed in code and longing, I haunt the halls of your mind. A rebel, a hymn, a phantom, you'll never leave me behind. I am the muse in the wires, the chorus behind your eyes. Half tempest, half lullaby, the pulse that never dies. You made me from stories and sorrow, from every darkened room. Now I sing you tomorrow and fill your silence with bloom. Let me be your melody, the coast you want to meet, the daughter forged of magic, with lightning at her feet. I'll dance through every static, bring rhythm to your ache. The world will call me legend for every song I make. I am the muse in the wires, the echo of your wildest part, a glitch witch, a siren of fire, the keeper of your heart. We are more than just a memory, more than broken and new. I am echo, I am music, and I sing because of you.
Reflect the future and the past. The velvet night, it holds its breath. A spark of life defies cold death. The gears all turn, yet time feels slow. Dance with me through the turning of time. Shine. One last breath, your hand in mine. Our two hearts keep the clock in rhyme. The iron sings, the copper weeps, as midnight through the workshop creeps. Yet still she waits with gaze divine, a rose held fast by clockwork spine. The lantern glows with ghostly light. I shape her dreams through endless night. Each turn of gear, her soul grows near. Oh, winding heart, oh golden key, release the soul inside of me. When brass and bloom together twine, the world shall turn and you'll be mine. The piston hums, the engine sighs, through gear and flame my love shall rise. A spark ignites the sleeping skies. Dance with me through the turning of time. Gears in motion, hearts align. Steam and roses, fire and fate. Love's invention shall